But maybe it's ironic that the West is now supporting a democracy movement in Hong Kong. In the late 1700s, the British East India Company, the largest transnational corporation of its time, was selling opium in China illegally. Millions of Chinese people became addicted, including large numbers of children. By the 1830s, British and American entrepreneurs were getting rich selling opium to these Chinese addicts. And when the Chinese government ordered them to stop, the British invaded, sending gunboats to Chinese ports and blockading the Pearl River. The British destroyed Chinese warships and looted entire cities. And once China was defeated militarily, China was forced to sign this treaty in 1842. It's the first of what the Chinese call the unequal treaties. And it gave the British control over Hong Kong Island. After it took the island, it used this perfect port city to ship drugs more efficiently.
Hong Kong was built on stolen land from the Opium Wars that Britain, US, France, Germany, the great powers of the time, but particularly Britain, imposed on China. And it was a demand under the name of free trade to sell opium in massive quantities throughout China. And when China resisted that, there was an invading army that literally looted the capital, the major cities, the ports of China, and imposed the opium trade and demanded open cities, which meant they set the rules.
During the entire British era, which lasts until 1997, there was a de facto kind of apartheid that existed in Hong Kong. Chinese people were treated like third-class citizens.
Somehow it's been lost in this that Hong Kong was stolen from China by the British Empire as part of a broader attempt to actually weaken China as a major world power, which is maybe the most anti-democratic thing you could think of, right? An empire just coming in and just stealing a part of a country.
In 1984, the Chinese and the British signed a joint declaration stating that China would resume its sovereignty over Hong Kong on July 1st, 1997, and that Hong Kong would exist under a policy called One Country, Two Systems. Britain's requirements for returning Hong Kong to China included no protections for democracy, but did, however, include protections for private property and provisions that Hong Kong would continue to operate as an outpost of Western capitalism.
The two systems, one country, that was imposed or demanded by Britain.
That something is upside down in society when students at the top university use their empty Olympic swimming pool to practice throwing Molotov cocktails. Welcome to the Polytechnic of Hong Kong. World leader in design, now world leader in insurrection. All the brains and discipline that usually go to higher education here are being deployed to turn this citadel of learning into a fortress of protest with bespoke barricades built to last. So every time I come back to Hong Kong, the protesters are at all escalation here. No dialogue, no compromise, no process to resolve this political dispute. Just a student resorting to bow and arrow. So what they're preparing here is the siege of the Polytechnic. Look at all this. Barricade after barricade, fully expecting the riot police to storm this place, possibly tonight. And there's absolutely no sign that any of them are going home or giving up. In fact, they're digging in. On one floor, they're busy making cement to make more barricades, or to cement the wheels of a barricading truck. Then there's the faculty of petrol bombs. Its trophies are poised everywhere, hundreds of them. While the real university trophies are languishing behind glass. Then there's the attention to detail. Bricks piled up like so many mini Stonehenges.
To replace and enshrined capitalist property relations in the harshest and strictest way. It means that 20% of the population is living in utter destitute poverty and no plan in place in terms of housing, jobs, and social development to really change this. Almost 15% of the population ranks as millionaires, 20% in utter poverty, and a huge middle grouping terrified of falling off the cliff.
From 1843 to 1985, the year after the Joint Declaration, there were no elections of any kind, and the first direct election didn't take place in Hong Kong until 1991.
It was at that time, after this Sino-British declaration, that they decided, well, we better introduce some elements of democracy. Now, prior to that, all officials in Hong Kong were just appointed by the Crown, so completely colonial, completely anti-democratic. What we see now, the current electoral system, the vast majority of that form of universal suffrage has been brought in post-1997. That is after the return of the sovereignty of the People's Republic of China. And it was directly connected to the idea that Britain wanted to create the illusion that, well, Hong Kong, the way we've run it, is democratic, as opposed to this undemocratic, authoritarian, communist government in China.
Unrest in Hong Kong taking place today, we must look at Hong Kong's underlying social and economic inequalities, as well as its political landscape. Let's tackle the social and economic inequalities first. Although Hong Kong is known internationally as being very wealthy and prosperous, that's not the case for all its residents. Over 1.3 million people live under the poverty line here. Over 250,000 people live in what SOCO calls inadequate housing. And over 40% of Hong Kong residents live in either public housing or subsidized housing.
SOCO is one of Hong Kong's largest social services organizations, and Si Lai Shan, a community organizer with them, showed us what some of these inadequate housing units look like these subdivided flats, and these caged homes. In a subdivided flat, your bed is your living space. Kitchens and bathrooms are shared, in this flat, by 24 people. Si Lai Shan thinks that some of the blame for the lack of affordable housing in Hong Kong gets misdirected to Beijing, when it belongs with Hong Kong's own property developers.
With the land reform, the resistance is mainly from within Hong Kong society. This includes
property developers who control a lot of land.
I spoke with Tek Chi Yuen, the former vice chair of the largest so-called pro-democracy party in Hong Kong, the Hong Kong Democrats. He says that he left that party because of its unwillingness to even have any dialogue with Beijing. He thinks that many Hong Kongers see democracy and government representation as their ticket to gaining better housing and living conditions, and that while the extradition law amendment may have been the trigger for this anti-government movement, it was never the full story.
The price of housing going up very fast. That means the rich people get more and more. The distribution of resources is unfair. So the young people angry about this. This is the fundamental problem. This is the root problem.
This inequality and the low standard of living in Hong Kong are virtually absent from coverage of the anti-government movement. And who's to blame for this? Well, Oxfam suggests that a responsibility lays not at the foot of Beijing, but at the local Hong Kong government. Raises to the minimum wage fall behind the rate of inflation, and privatization often runs unchecked.
The level of economic inequality in Hong Kong is rather staggering. The housing crisis in Hong Kong in some ways dwarfs the housing crisis in equivalent U.S. cities such as Los Angeles and in New York. The real estate industry in Hong Kong is perhaps even more potent than its counterpart in Manhattan that produced the 45th U.S. president. At the same time, you have countless numbers of poor people who are barely getting by. You have people living in what we might consider virtual closets, paying an arm and a leg to do so.
咁呢個面罩嘅意思就係對抗呢一個警察嘅過分暴力啦、濫權啦、濫暴啦、虐待市民啦、唔認錯啦，將啲問題全部都冰按我哋啲 protester 啦。行前行。鄰街嘅幫我離開，唔該曬大家。
你條防線喺邊度啊？
邊個站嘅地方，請你做好翻嚟啊！即刻走，即刻起晒警告你啊！
The top 12 Chinese companies on the Fortune 500 list are all either state-owned or subsidized. They include massive oil, solar, energy, telecommunications, engineering, and construction companies.
There's a stark contrast between Chinese policy, social policy, and Hong Kong social policy when it comes to this. Hong Kong, even though it has had a budget surplus recently, it is unwilling to spend to reduce the high levels of inequality, to improve the employment outlook, the outlook for the elderly and the homeless. And this is really putting a strain on people's everyday lives. A lot of younger people are really discontented with the level of inequality that exists in Hong Kong.
Trying to block all the roads nearby the campus, prevent from police coming here. We are just doing things independently. We know the tactics, we know the measures, so if there are something we are insufficient, we just prepare to them.
We defend the campus because it is our home. They were trying to attack our home because this campus is our university's place, and what they are trying to do yesterday is they're trying to invade our place, and we cannot accept that.
真係有手都打定聲啊！